Chapter 10, Death and Dying, Social Emotional Aspects. So, in this section, we will talk about the emotional aspects of death and the social aspects of death. So, let's start with the emotional aspects of death. So, emotional aspects are a person's attitude that often predicts and guides their behavior. So, attitudes are acquired as a person develops throughout their lifespan, and a person is socialized to have certain feelings, values, beliefs, and they learn these vicariously through others, so parents, peer groups, and society. Now, emotional aspects of death are intertwined with social influences. So, in the US, for instance, death is seen as sad, a loss, grief, confusion, denial, and shock are a lot of the common reactions that are associated with death, whereas in other countries, it is more of a natural process. So, grief and loss. Grief is the natural and expected response to a personal loss, and it's often used interchangeably with the word bereavement. Mourning is the socially prescribed ways of expressing grief. And in the US, it's seen as more of a behind the scenes type of mourning, whereas in other countries, they may mourn loudly and cry, and they're very loud when they're experiencing grief. So it all depends on culture and where you live and how you were raised and what's socially acceptable in your context. So dealing with the death of any loved one is difficult, and it's very difficult for children, primarily because they don't have the cognitive processing to be able to deal with these abstract things. And common types of parental loss and grief during this time are things like miscarriage, stillbirth, neonatal death, and sudden infant death syndrome. So it's particularly hard for children to deal with death, but also for parents to deal with the death of a child. So, miscarriages, this is the natural loss of an embryo, and it can happen before a woman knows she's pregnant or from conception to about 19 weeks. Typically, miscarriages will occur before the 10th week, and it's due to natural causes and unnatural causes. And there's a couple of different types of miscarriages. There's a complete miscarriage where all the fetal tissue has been expelled from the body, an incomplete miscarriage where the fetal tissue has not passed out completely, and oftentimes it may result in a dilation of the cervix for a D&C cleaning. And then inevitable is the process of expelling the fetal tissue. It's a process, so it happens over time. So they may do a D&C, or they may give a pill to help the body to expel the fetal tissue. Miscarriage is when the embryo dies in the womb, but it is not passed out. This also results in having a D&C or medical intervention. And then a threatened miscarriage is when there are symptoms that are present, but a miscarriage does not occur. Now, the loss can be very overwhelming to parents. Most parents feel guilty and they blame themselves for the miscarriage occurring, even if it's nothing that could have been prevented. The causes also, it causes couples to rush into initiating another pregnancy. So they're trying to fill that loss from the miscarriage by having another baby. Now, there are also community support groups and church ministries that can also help couples work through this time, through this grief process as well. So stillbirth, neonatal death, and prenatal death. Prenatal death. So stillbirths are death of the fetus before birth due to any one number of several reasons. So it could be the baby's heartbeat, it could be the umbilical cord, it could be a blood clot. There could be many reasons for a stillbirth. Neonatal death is the death of a baby during the neonatal period, which is from birth to about 2 weeks. And society tends to discount stillbirth and neonatal death because it is believed that an attachment has not occurred with the mother and the child. However, those who have experienced this loss do not agree with this because they went through this 9-month period of getting attached to the baby in the womb. Now, perinatal death is a term that includes death from 20 weeks gestation, so still in the womb, to 4 weeks after birth. Now, this causes a crisis for many young couples. Women blame themselves, and men feel guilty or responsible in some way for the death of a baby. And counseling may be a necessity to work through grief and to save a couple's relationship, especially if they're blaming themselves or maybe even blaming each other. So, a term that a lot of people are using today for any type of stillbirth, neonatal death is what is known as a rainbow baby. And a rainbow baby is a baby that is born following a miscarriage, a stillbirth, or a neonatal death or infant loss. And in the real world, a beautiful and bright rainbow follows after a storm and gives a hope of things getting better. So the rainbow is more of an appreciation of having the experience, the storm, in comparison to never experiencing it at all. So the storm is the pregnancy loss has already happened and nothing can change, and the storm clouds might still be overhead as the family continues to cope, but that there's going to be something bright that emerges from the darkness and the misery of losing a baby. So, sudden infant death syndrome is one of the primary causes for unexpected death in infancy. And the likely causes is a genetic predisposition of the brain and a brain defect. Maternal smoking, secondhand smoke, low birth weight, premature birth, co-sleeping, heavy blankets are also high risk for SIDS. Breastfeeding and sleeping in the parent's room, not in the same bed, so no co-sleeping, because we talked about that earlier about how parents may flip and flop and cause suffocation. Sleeping with a fan on and sleeping on the back seem to help prevent SIDS. And SIDS is pretty rampant in the U.S., with approximately 5,000 infant lives being claimed yearly. And it's in that peak age from 2 months and 4 months. So the grief wheel is a model that helps to explain the grief process. And this model describes the grief reactions to any kind of loss. So the life path theoretically proceeds in a fairly uneventful manner until a loss occurs, and then people are struck with shock, protest, disorganization, reorganization, going on into recovery or deterioration. So there is a period of a personal decline and disorganization when dealing with grief. And then finally, the grieving person, like I said, will either reconcile the loss or they will achieve a redefinition of life. And we're going to talk about each of these steps individually. So, shock. The very first reaction to loss is shock or confusion and denial. And the reactions are health promoting at this time because they prevent against the initial severity of the loss. So it's kind of a coping mechanism. Now, the outward manifestation range from common reactions of crying and some symptoms of depression, so not being able to eat or not being able to sleep. But as the grief process continues, it gets more intense. So protest is the next stage, and this is characterized by further symptoms of depression, such as fear and anger. And anger is the prominent expression, the outward expression of grief. And during this time, it allows people to allow themselves to experience the pain of the loss, and their adjustment and the recovery are enhanced because they're getting that opportunity to get those feelings out, even if it may be in anger. So disorganization, this is the low point of dealing with grief, and this is often termed as bottoming out. So people will either accept the reality of the loss or they will continue to function in this bottoming out period, this disorganized manner. So apathy and withdrawal are hallmarks during this time, and depression may be fully symptomized at this time. So at the end of this step, people desire to recover the object of their loss. So they may go and visit the grave sites, they may go to the person's room, keep it exactly the way it is, and be very reluctant in getting rid of anything that the person possessed before their death. So redefining life, this is what is known as grief work. And this stage is where people accept the reality of their loss and begin the business of rebuilding their lives. So people fully experience the pain of the loss, but the feelings are free and they come to terms with life that does not include the loss of that person. So people may appear to be emotionally sterile or offish and closed off at the to the relationships at the beginning, but later they begin to feel again and come to terms with the new reality. So during this time, they're reassessing and redefining personal priorities or goals, especially if it's the loss of a child or a spouse compared to a friend. So, what is life going to be like after this? Um, am I going to be able to afford to live in the house, or am I going to have to move? So, there's a lot of things that come to play with this. Now, functioning resumes at a greater level than known prior to the loss. So, successfully, when they go to the redefining stage, they have more self awareness and enhancement of why they're doing what they're doing, and they're a little bit more motivated for why they have to get to that point. So, there's also 7 behaviors and feelings in the grieving process, and Kavanaugh identified 7 behaviors and emotions associated with this, which may be experienced by individuals coping with grief. And they're kind of similar to the grief wheel, but they're a little bit different as well. So the first behavior is shock, which is the first stage in the grief wheel. And shock is that emotional inability to accept the reality of the death. And denial is one of the most common reactions, and there is that numbness period. So the first reaction is it can't be true, and then why me, and then anger sets in. So again, the why me. Now, the next stage is disorganization, and this is the reality of the loss begins to sink in, and a person may feel confused, disorganized, or out of touch with reality. So, routines are disturbed, and a person may not know how to do day to day life with dealing with this grief. The next stage is volatile emotion, and these emotions can include anger, resentment, fear, hurt, frustration, and helplessness. So these emotions may manifest in significant behavior changes, and the strong and overwhelming feelings can lead a grieving person to make rash and hasty decisions. So this is why having a will is very important, because a lot of times the person who is left behind after the death is on emotions. So they're attempting to, it's kind of hard for them to listen and to think clearly when they're so overwhelmed and stressed with the feelings of grief. So the next behavior is guilt. And during this stage, a person may look for ways in which they could have prevented the loss. And they may start to blame themselves. And they're having trouble with that, if only I would have done this. The next behavior is sense of loss and loneliness. And as life continues, a person may feel left behind, and the rest of the world will continue, but they may not know how to engage socially. They may feel alone in their grief because everybody else is moving on already. So holidays, social engagements, listening to friends may actually heighten a sense of loneliness and loss for them, because they're still in that period of feeling grief. The next behavior is relief, and this is where a person may eventually begin to feel a sense of relief that the loss has was finally endured. And a person may recognize that the pain that they of the loved one before they passed away. And then the last behavior is what is known as reestablishment. And this is where the coping is and they're ultimately developing a personal and singular experience. So no one can help them go through it more easily or understand all the emotions they're going through, but others can be there to help you with the process. So making the burial arrangements, helping you with the estate, helping you with all the things that are left behind that you may have to take into account. So, task of mourning. The mourning process is conceptualized as having four necessary tasks that must be addressed before closure can occur. And these four tasks are based on the National Institute of Health. So, acceptance that the loss is real is one of the main tasks in the mourning process. Suffer through the emotional turmoil and misery of grief is also a very important task to overcome when it comes to mourning. Adapting to daily life without the deceased, and then redirecting that emotional energy once focused upon the deceased loved one and the relationship to new and viable relationships, whether that be volunteering, entering the job force again, um, or anything that a person may want to do to be able to move on and create these new relationships. So there are a couple of factors that affect the grief process. Gender is one of them. Men and women differ in their reactions to death. So after the death of a spouse, women experience more health problems, death anxiety, feelings of anger, social isolation, depersonalization, and depression. And they have a greater sense of abandonment, whereas men have difficulty adjusting to the death. They feel that they have lost a part of themselves and they take longer to adjust to their new life. Now, after the death of a child, mothers have more extreme reactions and more difficulty coping with holidays, birthdays, and the anniversary of a death. And this is primarily due to the attachment differences, gender roles, social norms, and expectations. So, age also is a factor affecting the grief process. So, young children experience grief even when they do not have an accurate understanding of death. So, they show physical and psychological manifestations of death, such as bedwetting, regressive, overdependent type behaviors, aggressive temper tantrums, and exaggerated death fantasies. And this is primarily because they do not have a concrete understanding of what it means. And if we go back to what we talked about in the biological factors, they are believing that people are asleep and that an adult can wake them up. So they really don't understand what is happening. School age children reactions range from guilt to a desire to protect the surviving parent. So dealing with the death can have an increased risk for academic problems, depression, social withdrawal, anxiety, and behavioral problems. And then adolescents follow more adult grief reactions. Now, behavior problems can occur if adolescents are not encouraged to deal with the grief in an open manner. And then adult mourning is characterized by the realization that significant social interactions is lost and vary according to the mourner's personalities. So, personality is a big factor in how someone deals with the grief process. So, those who have a dependent personality are more vulnerable to a difficult grief reaction. So, these are people that rely on their significant other for approval, they have low tolerance for frustration, and they have high levels of anxiety. So, they center their emotional lives around the well being of their relationships. And once those relationships are gone, they have a lot of trouble with feeling helpless or not knowing how to direct their attention, where they're going to get their approval. So they're likely to experience depression, a lengthy bereavement time, and they're less optimistic when it comes to recovery and getting over the grief. Culture also plays a factor in the grief process. So in the US, we tend to prescribe mourning the dead. It should be done in private. So a lot of funeral homes and mortuaries have what is known as grieving rooms. And the intent of this is to give the family privacy during these highly emotional events. And some subcultures in the US do permit this unrestrained emotional reactions. So you may have certain people that live in the US, but they may mourn loudly, or they may yell, or they may cry or fall down to show their feelings towards the loss of someone. Family rituals also play a factor in the grieving process. So, rituals are important because they promote acceptance of death rather than denial, and they help people express feelings in a nonverbal way. and it facilitates the bereavement process. So these are things like funerals, wakes, viewings, visitations, memorials, the wheel, removal of a wedding ring and passing it down, visiting the grave, headstones, or releasing balloons to memorialize the person um, going to heaven. So, grief therapy is something that can help a lot of people when they're dealing with grief. So, before grief therapy, there are some suggestions for providing grief support. So, giving a person permission to grieve by listening and providing appropriate supportive statements. Also, making sure that the ways that we work with people are meaningful to that person, encouraging them to express it and recognizing grief themselves, supporting the person's acceptance of the loss by acting as a mirror of reality, listening to the person sharing any information about the normal process, and then assisting in ways that are meaningful. So, helping them with housework, taking care of the children, helping them with estates and things like that. Now, sometimes people need more professional assistance when dealing with grief, and this is what is known as grief therapy. And this is professional counseling that is aimed at helping individuals who experience difficulty in completing the grief process. And especially when people have what is known as a complicated grief, this is grief that involve that have an adjustment disorder or interferes with a person's ability to function. So that is a real need for grief therapy as well. And then self-help books and support groups can also be helpful during this time. So, helping children cope with loss, children again have adaptive capabilities, but they're challenged when facing loss, especially because they're very concrete in their thinking. So, social support is very important, and it is best to follow the child's lead and to respect his or her process for coping. And there's lots of strategies for children to help them have different outlets for expressing their loss and their grief. So things like a bereavement counseling, art therapy, mime, role playing, stories, stories about death, creating a timeline, using puppets or dolls to express their feelings. And art therapy is one of the big ones that is used with children. And this just gives them a therapeutic tool towards healing, clearing the mind, and self expression. So it gives them a chance to artistically show their feelings. So we're going to pause and process what we have covered so far. So go back and look at the slides as needed to address these questions. So, social aspects of death. So, there are a lot of American death rituals, and the purpose of these death rituals are to provide a means of disposing of the body. So, family and friends are provided a forum in which to remember and reminisce about a person's life. And seeing the body or the casket helps people accept the reality of death. And the funeral or memorial service is a rite of passage, and mourners are expected to return to life, to their daily life and tasks after, especially in the U.S. So there are some common types of death rituals in the United States. So burial services, memorials, cremation, and green burials. And we'll talk about what each of these are. So a memorial service is a service held to memorize a deceased person with their body not present. So the urn may be there, they may have pictures, it may be at someone's house, it could also be at a funeral home, but it's there to give people a chance to say goodbye and to express their feelings about the loss of someone. Cremations are the disposal of a dead person's body by burning it to ashes, and the ashes are typically either kept in an urn or they are scattered. It depends on the person's request. So burials and green burials are both types of burials, but a burial is a ceremony at which a body is buried, and then typically it's marked with a gravestone or a marker. Green burials are the use of biodegradable caskets, and it's integrated forest and conservation efforts in graveyards. So here's an example of what this would look like. So this would be a traditional type of burial, whereas a green burial would be a wicker casket instead of a wooden casket, so that it's more bio conscious and environmentally friendly. Also, the graves being shorter or not as deep as well, and the differences in the headstone compared to a rock and things like that. So, children and death rituals. Now, children do benefit emotionally by being allowed to participate in death rituals such as eulogies, writing the obituary, and attending the funeral. And children's questions should be answered honestly, but at their level. So you don't need to necessarily go into details that they're not going to be able to understand. And then children often provide support to grieving adults that are also dealing with this process. So there are some religious traditions that are different in regard to what to do with a body after death. So the Hindu religion, they have a ceremony where the body is washed, clothed in a shroud, covered with flowers, and then carried to be cremated. And then the ashes are later retrieved and placed in a sacred river. And they embrace cremation. Same with Buddhism. However, Muslim religions forbid cremation. They bury the body shortly after death, and the cultural norm is for women to wail at the funeral loudly to show their grief. Now, Catholic religions, they have funeral rites that are laid out by the order of Christian funerals. So there's 3 steps to a Catholic funeral. So there's the vigil, the funeral liturgy, and the rite of the comitial. So the first step is the funeral that may take place in a funeral parlor, home, or a church. And it's a short duration, and it focuses mainly on prayer. There may be readings and music as well. The second step is taking place in the church, and it focuses on God's love and mercy and the promise of eternal life. And then the very last step is the Catholic funeral, where the body is or the body or the ashes is sprinkled with holy water, and then maybe incense as well, and then placed in its final resting place. Now, historical perspectives of death, culture does shape the death rituals that a culture has. So culture shapes death rituals, and death can also shape culture. So a historical thing that happened in the Middle Ages was the bubonic plague, or the Black Death. And it brought about a child's rhyme that is still very popular today, known as Ring Around the Rosie. And you may have sang this or actually did the dance when you were in early childhood age classes. Now, the meaning of this rhyme was that life could be unimaginably beautiful and the reality is unbearably horrible. Because this nursery rhyme, so ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Well, posies were considered a way that the disease would not enter into a doctor through airborne. So they would pick these flowers and they would carry them around in their pocket and wear masks that would cover their mouths with posies in them to keep them from getting the disease. And then the Black Death, in general, it killed about 1/3 of the Western Europeans' population, and has contributed to shifts in political and religion and that are still evident in culture today. So understanding that diseases can be passed through air and touch, and then how we dispose of bodies. So ashes, the bodies were being burned to keep the disease, and especially since it was so rampant. So we're going to pause and process again, go back and review as needed to address these questions.